Right, hello, my little friends, and I hope that you're all well and everything is proceeding as you have foreseen in terms of the courseworks and the modules, and the year is going well despite the evolutionary sort of nature of the coronavirus. And today I thought we would do the psychology of play, and it's very, very sort of important for you to appreciate why people actually sort of play computer games. What are their motivations for playing computer games? Because you are basically going to be designing these things, or if you're a computer animation art student, you're certainly going to be involved in the constituents of computer games, designing the constituents, developing the constituents. Now, when I was at university doing software engineering, we had a number of sort of psychology modules associated with that, human-computer interfaces, human-computer systems, I seem to remember, and that was really to show us, or make us appreciate how people actually interact with a computer, and to at least contemplate this in terms of things like design. So one thing that always sticks in my memory is the GOMS model, goals, objectives or objects, methods and selections model. And one thing that made me sort of appreciate was when you actually go to a cache point, your main goal is actually to get cash out of that cache point and make a withdrawal. Now, from a design point of view, it's far, far better to give you your card back before you actually complete that goal. So you've got to more or less tie up all the secondary goals before you allow completion of the primary goal. So if you just simply give people cash, they'll walk away and forget all about their card, and that'll be it. But if you give them their card first, then the secondary goal is sort of completed, and then you can give them the cash, and everything is fine, and they move on with their lives. So things like that, it's important to sort of consider these things. Okay, so why is it important? Obviously you're going to be building them, or you could be building constituents of computer games. But then have you also considered other little things like what is play? Why is play important? Play is incredibly important for children in terms of conflict resolution. What is gameplay? What does that actually consist of? What is playability? It consists of a whole load of different sort of heuristics. What are the motivations for playing computer and video games in terms of intrinsic motivations? Is it extrinsic motivation? You consider things like Malone and Lepper's framework of intrinsic motivation, challenge, fantasy. Are these motivations interpersonal, intrapersonal, individual, that sort of thing? Perceptual and cognitive outcomes and impacts of playing computer games. There's a lot of outcomes and impacts of actually playing these things. So things like knowledge acquisition, perhaps, behavioural change, perceptual and cognitive outcomes and impacts as well. And there's also positives of playing computer games. They can be very, very educational. They can assist you with your visual spatial recognition, your coordination, that sort of thing. But they can also be incredibly negative in terms of promoting antisocial behaviour, bad healthy lifestyles are probably sort of negated, perhaps, in terms of obesity, having a sort of sedentary lifestyle, messing up your sleeping patterns. There can be violent connotations associated with the computer games as well. So negatives exist too. So there's positives and negatives, and we'll have a look at them. Computer games, why is it important? Computer games, video games, mobile games are now entirely ubiquitous. They are like Starbucks, they're everywhere. So that's just, ubiquitous gaming is really a new paradigm. And a paradigm is really a typical example of something, so a pattern or a model. So when you think of something like an ideal marriage, an ideal woman, an ideal career, an ideal blueprint for life in terms of society and expectations and conformity. There's a convergence of sensing, digital communications, and computing nowadays. Embedded technology to support user needs, whatever they may be, in fact. You have to be environmentally aware of the location, the context. There's different sorts of kinds of these deliverables as well. It can be virtual reality, being augmented reality, mixed reality. Pervasive games spreading wildly through a sort of group of people so that they're always available. So that's why it's important. They're just bloody everywhere in various different guises. They're becoming more advanced, more interactive in terms of virtual reality, augmented reality. So that's why they're sort of important. Here's two examples of pervasive games. Things like Pokemon Go just appears on your phone and you go and capture Pokemon and pit them against each other in a battle. Killer, game of assassination, perhaps. So these are sort of examples of pervasive games. In his book, Homo Ludens, however that's pronounced, a study of the play element in culture by Johann Huizinga, hopefully that's the correct way to pronounce it as well. He addresses what play actually is, and he says, summing up the formal characteristics of play, we might call it a free activity, standing quite consciously outside ordinary life, as being not serious, but at the same time absorbing the player intensely and utterly. It is an activity connected with no mental interest and no profit can be gained by it. It proceeds within its own proper boundaries of time and space according to fixed rules and in an orderly manner. It promotes the formation of social groupings that tend to surround themselves with secrecy and to stress the difference from the common world by disguise or other means. So sort of the important things to take from that is that you have social groupings, very, very important for children. It's bringing in concepts of rules. It immerses people entirely. It's outside ordinary life, so in some ways it's sort of slightly simulated. It absorbs them intensely and utterly. And it allows them to formulate social groupings and socially acceptable behaviour and conflict resolution. So that's a sort of definition of what play is according to him. Comparatively, relatively little research has been done on the benefits of playing computer games because computer games and video games haven't really existed for that great a length of time when you consider the entire span of human history. And of course, play did exist before video games and mobile games and computer games became ubiquitous. So, Erickson, 1977, proposed that play context allows children to experiment with social experiences and think about different possible contingencies, simulate alternative emotional consequences, which can then bring about feelings of resolution outside the play context. And adults are, of course, sort of different, although are they? They probably aren't. I mean, adults probably have greater sort of verbal power in terms of being able to say, I'm really not happy about this, and therefore I think we should duke it out, or at least have a talk about it. Whereas children don't necessarily have that level of emotional maturity, perhaps verbal power. But let's face it, I mean, adults do sort of have this dynamic, perhaps, where you're in an argument and you go away from the argument, you think, damn it, I should have said that, I would have won. And you sort of fantasize about what would have been if you just said this particular thing. And, you know, I would be very, very, very suspicious if you have someone in your life that always wins an argument, because I consider myself to be a reasonably intelligent individual, and sometimes I sort of go into arguments and I'm expecting a particular outcome, and I'm always sort of slightly surprised, and I would say that, oh, okay, I kind of lost that one. You know, maybe arguments, unless arguments are 50-50, then you can probably imagine that the person is quite tyrannical and not particularly objective. But you do come away from arguments and you start to fantasize about what you should have said, and, you know, it's sort of Blackadder, you know, when he says, it's often too late, sir, when one thinks of what one should have said. You know, Sir Thomas More, for instance, burned alive for refusing to recant his Catholicism, must have been kicking himself as the flames leapt higher that it never occurred to him to say, I recant my Catholicism. But also, there's another sort of aspect in that series, Blackadder, the third, that talks about how adults are more sort of direct. When Mrs. Miggins sort of says to him, you know, I don't suppose you know anything about that, being only a little butler. They do say, Mrs. M, that verbal insults hurt more than physical pain. They are, of course, wrong, as you'll soon discover when I stick this toasting fork in your head. So, in essence, adults could be more direct, and they'll get sort of greater verbal power, but play does constitute a great avenue for children to experiment with social conflict resolution strategies, I would say. And researchers before myself have said that as well. But of course, now we have video games that are entirely ubiquitous and allow people to sort of escape into that sort of realm of fantasy and have their particular conflicts more or less resolved in a way that they could possibly fantasize about or see fit. So I suppose the point I'm sort of making here is whether you're a sort of Magneto fan or a Wolverine fan. I personally am a Magneto fan, and I really don't know why he doesn't just flick his finger and destroy him because he's made of metal. But anyway, it depends how you actually want to fantasize the outcome to that particular scenario if they are pitted against each other. Piaget in 1962 theorized that make-believe play provides children opportunities to reproduce real-life conflicts, an excellent opportunity to work out ideal resolutions for their own pleasure and ameliorate negative feelings. Developmentalists have emphasized that play constitutes an emotionally significant context through different themes and can be enacted productively. Okay, so power and dominance, aggression, nurturance, anxiety, pain, loss, growth, joy. There is absolutely no boundaries to play, with the exception of the imagination of the child playing. And it could possibly, potentially be argued that we do sort of stifle children's imagination nowadays, because when I was young, it was a case of here, have this stick, go out, enjoy it, go out into the world and go and play. And you think to yourself, right, what can I do with this stick? Your imagination is probably far, far, far more developed. And people say to me, you know, oh, you need to go around the world. And I'm like, not really. I'll just visualize Drogon from Game of Thrones going round about the entire place, killing everyone in the gym. That's what I sort of do. I've got a very active imagination because of that, and I live very, very much inside my own head. And now you get people that probably expect constant entertainment. You know these people, I'm bored, and they expect entertainment to be provided where other people actually formulate their own entertainment. And I suppose you get two sorts of people that decide to develop themselves, perhaps listening to an audiobook or something like that. And then you get other people that just prefer sort of delving into distraction and will possibly watch, I don't know, 40, 50 hours of Buffy the Vampire Slayer for over a 3-day period or something like that. And you know, you just get different sorts of kind of people that can use the brain in a different way. And I would say that the older generations, I'm about 40, so I think I'm kind of relatively okay about that imagination, developing myself, that sort of thing. And I don't expect entertainment to be provided constantly. Where nowadays, if you view children, teenagers, even sort of 20, 30-year-olds thereabouts, they expect people to come along and entertain them, or they expect electronic entertainment, and they'll just sit there and go, I'm bored, until something happens. But anyway. Here's children here fantasizing about having a little sort of tea party, and of course that shows them about the sort of social conformity, the etiquette associated with that sort of thing. And then of course you've got this little show off here who built this great big huge castle with his dad, and that is showing that you know, there's a great deal of sort of creativity associated with play, problem solving, creativity and imagination, and there you go. So very, very crucial in terms of development of children. So the founder of the National Institute for Play notes that there is a strong correlation between success and playful activity. How they actually define success is, you know, up for debate. Coincidentally, this research research on play came about by researching murderers, where a common theme in their interviews was a lack of childhood play. So it just goes to show that if you don't have sort of simulated conflict resolution, that you can end up being the killer clown. This is John Wayne Gacy. He murdered 33 young men, and apparently play was not part of his childhood. I don't know, but his dad used to beat him up, I know that much. Whether play was part of his childhood is sort of up for debate, but obviously it came out of this research, I think. We have Kemper. His mother sort of kept him in a basement away from his siblings until he hit about puberty, and he murdered 10 people, decapitating them, if memory serves, women, including his mother, I think. But anyway, that sort of goes to show what happens if you don't let children interact with other children and have some form of playful conflict resolution. And for the hell of it, we'll just get Twisted Clown. I've always quite enjoyed this because, I mean, he's quite clearly evil, he's always dripping in blood, and it's actually quite funny. And I sort of remember when he's appeared in American Horror Story, and you saw this woman sort of driving along, being driven along in a limo, and it's a case of, "Clown, can you come and entertain at my son's birthday party?" And you go, if you can't tell that that clown is evil, then, you know, I don't know what to tell you, because I mean, he's got a head in the bag, and he's covered in blood, and he's got a machete or something like that. In the animal kingdom, play is entirely essential. So when you consider lions learning how to have a fight or whatever, if they didn't do that in a sort of simulated capacity, they would just rip each other to shreds. And it's the same here with the dad, the mums are sort of watching on, you know, don't you kill that baby, and they possibly, you know, could commit a bit of infanticide if they wanted, if they weren't in fact just playing. Now, I suppose that lions, like all creatures, care about their kids, but they do sometimes. In the animal kingdom, infanticide is a bit of an issue, or at least it can be. So simulated play is highly, highly important. And they sort of do that when they're teaching them how to hunt as well. So they sort of finish off, or they make them target a little sort of sickly gazelle or wildebeest or whatever the hell that is, and they sort of beat it up a little bit, and they say, "There you go, son, finish it off," and it goes. We've all sort of seen that sort of thing in Jurassic Park. Was it 2 or 3? I think it's Jurassic Park 2 actually. And you see the person that's sort of wronged the T-Rex's baby. The T-Rex comes in and sort of doesn't deliver the death blow, but finishes them off significantly enough, and then lets the baby, you know, have at it, sort of thing. So we've even sort of seen it in the Lion King as well, where play is an appropriate sort of way of learning how to hunt. He sort of works in his roar, and he sort of works in his pounce, and that's all done through playing, and he's also sort of playing with his dad in order to learn how to fight. Okay, one of the major restrictions of video games is that they generally only become relevant when you're about 5 or 6. This is when you're sort of coordinated or grown up enough to actually sort of utilise them. And they are sort of contextualised, so there's Minecraft there. I've got a picture of the Simpsons there, Simpsons episode, and that's the one where they actually all go to Florida for spring break, I believe. And that's to sort of show that is a series that's always sort of contextualised as well. And contextualisation is important in terms of remembering. And you always sort of remember the Simpsons are going to Japan, the Simpsons are going to Australia. And when you consider something like Family Guy, which is probably, you know, there's far more swearing, far more sort of sexual content, but it's far less structured in a sense that you think to yourself, I can't really remember any specific episodes, it's just like an array of flashbacks. There's only a few that I sort of remember, the Road to the North Pole or something, which was a Christmassy episode, and then another one, you know, where Stewie killed Lois, Peter got blamed, Peter went to court, Lois came back, wasn't really dead. So Lois kills Stewie, Lois kills Stewie, and Stewie kills Lois. I seem to remember that, and that's about it. So lack of contextualisation seems to result in being less memorable, shall we say. Then, of course, when you talk about Lego, creativity, building blocks, I mean, there's a contextualization there. Starkiller Base, is it Starkiller Base? I don't know, it's something to do with Star Wars. Anyway, and if you contextualize that, then all the better. If you walk through Buchanan Galleries at this particular point. You'll probably see Death Stars and things like that on sale for about £600 for Christmas, that sort of thing. So, look at play. What is gameplay? Gameplay is a term used to define the way that players interact with a video or computer game. It's further characterised as the way the game is played, and it includes rules, plot, objectives, and how to conquer them, as well as the player's overall experience. So the player's experience is one of the most important factors in gameplay and helps us to determine if the game is in fact a success. If the player doesn't like it, then the game isn't necessarily going to be successful, is it? So playability, this is a set of properties or heuristics that describe the player experience using a specific game system, whose main objectives is to provide enjoyment, entertainment. It's got to be credible, it's got to be satisfying when the player plays either alone or in company. So here's some of these things here in terms of heuristic effectiveness, the degree to which specific users can achieve the proposed completeness and accuracy. Efficiency, the degree to which specific users can achieve the goals proposed by investing an appropriate amount of resources, whether that's time or whatever. And it's determined by ease of learnability, understandability, memorability, and immersion. These are some of these made-up words, I suppose, that if you put likability, learnability, likability, if you put these things into Microsoft Word, it generally grumbles. Immersion as well. Immersion is one of those great big sort of huge complicated fields. It's in psychology. It consists of strategic immersion, narrative immersion, tactical immersion. It's very, very complicated. Flexibility, can the video game be used in different contexts or by different players or game profiles? Safety is an acceptable level of risk to the player in terms of health, satisfaction, fun, attractiveness, likability, comfort, trust, emotion. Intrinsic is the playability inherent in the game and how it's actually presented. Is it intuitive, I suppose, might be another way of putting it. Sometimes in a game there's generally a sort of tutorial. Every game has a bit of a purpose, if it's even if it's not a serious game for education and training purposes, and it's to teach you actually how to use that particular game. Now, if a game is intuitive, then most people could just sort of pick up a controller and start, and that's great. And if not, then there's a problem, okay? Mechanical, the quality of the game is a software system. Maybe the software system isn't particularly great. And maybe the graphical user interface isn't great. Maybe the controls aren't brilliant. I always remember Harry Potter, the Deathly Hallows, Part 1, and the control mechanism was just absolutely, utterly awful. And I paid £55 for it, and I had to wear the cloak of invisibility, go backwards through this crowded area, and it was completely and utterly logistically unfair. And that made it a terrible, terrible game. Interactivity, the interaction with the video game interface perhaps, is the quality of the graphics, the art, the aesthetics, the melodies, the storyline, all up to scratch, up to current standards. Is it interpersonal, intrapersonal? So basically, if someone's interacting with other people, is that effective? Or whether they're just sort of playing themselves, are they internally satisfied? That's something to contemplate. There's a set of factors measuring the ease of comfort and fun. Gameplay includes the type of game, such as the first-person shooters, platformers, role-playing games, and how the game follows or deviates from the set gameplay formulas in each sort of genre as well. That has to be sort of taken into account. So gameplay features might include things like what the player can actually do with the character, shooting, jumping, swimming, crafting items, using magic, how the game handles player death, whether you just simply respawn, permadeath, whatever. So let's have a look at these. Playability, there are various methods that can be used to actually measure playability and help improve the game, and that's these list of heuristics here. that's in a particular sort of framework that I'm about to show you, and that's learning, immersion, emotion, satisfaction, efficiency, motivation, and socialization. So that sort of all comes in here. So if you look at motivation, you're looking at things like self-improvement, diversity perhaps, emotion, conduct, reaction, socialization, sharing, communication, group awareness, social perception, satisfaction, fun, attractiveness, learnability, frustration, skills that are going to be pleasantly frustrating, speed, discovery, that sort of thing, game knowledge as well. So it's important to consider these particular heuristics as well. Now, this is really a conceptual map and not theoretical, showing genres against two important dimensions, namely the complexity and the level of social interaction. So the complexity is going on the sort of y-axis here, and the level of social interaction is going along the x-axis. Now, if you just sort of, it's almost as if someone has decided to draw this in a very simple sort of way, and then more or less throw a dart into everything and say this is exactly where this lies. So if you consider something like World of Warcraft, for example, MMORPG, massively multiplayer online role-playing game, then that's a lot of socializing in there, so high social aspect, and it's also a great deal of complexity as well. So when you consider something like Mario, perhaps that's not particularly social, maybe individual, but it's not exactly at the simplest level of platformer either. So it's important to sort of think about these in terms of a sort of conceptual map, if you will, and possibly map it against complexity of the game and the social interaction that's actually required within that game as well. So what motivates people to play computer games? Malone and Lepper present a framework of intrinsic motivation that I've used multiple times at the university in 2005, 2007 and 2009. And there are individual factors consisting of things like challenge, and that means that the player must be able to vary the difficulty in the game to an appropriate level of challenge. Fantasy, they have to feel immersed in the game and feel some form of relation to the characters, the virtual world. Curiosity, there has to be some form of sensory stimulation in order to ensure that prolonged participation actually exists. Control, they have to be able to make choices, see the consequences, be producers in the game as well. Interpersonal factors, cooperation, the player should derive some form of satisfaction from actually playing with others to achieve common goals. Competition, the player should be able to compare their performance to others, perhaps. Recognition, and they're actually getting some form of satisfaction from the accomplishments when they are recognised by others, by their peers. Now, these particular dynamics are a wee bit more complex than they first sort of appear. So when you're talking about cooperation and competitiveness, you may actually get cooperative teams fighting against each other in a competitive battle or something like that. So it does really depend on the particular player dynamic that people relate to, and whether that's individualistic, cooperative, or competitive is really to do with their particular player type and learning type, and just type in general, person type. Extrinsic motivation, this really occurs when we perform a behaviour in order to get some form of tangible reward, like money. So in this case, you engage not because you enjoy it or because you find it satisfying, but to get something in return, or perhaps avoid something unpleasant. So if your mum does or goes nuts or something like that because you haven't made your bed, you just decide, okay, I'm going to make my bed and then avoid that unpleasant scenario. Intrinsic motivation, they become engaged in a behaviour because it's personally rewarding, essentially performing an activity for its own sake, rather than the desire for some form of external reward. And essentially the behaviour itself is its own reward. Now, extrinsic and intrinsic motivation are probably linked more inextricably interconnected than people think, I would say. It's sort of cyclical, perhaps. So yes, what I sort of mean by that is when I first took up Thai boxing, I decided I'm doing that for an extrinsic sort of motive. I'll do that so I can defend myself and perhaps beat the hell out of people. And then when I started to go to it, I started to actually sort of enjoy it, and it became intrinsic. So from an extrinsic sort of point of view, I then became intrinsically motivated in the process. And it's the same with running as well. I decided that I would do that for the extrinsic reward of actually burning calories and lose a bit of weight, but now I actually kind of slightly enjoy running. So intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, as I've said, are inextricably interconnected and can sort of overlap. What motivates people to play computer games? Now, when you look at statements like this, wow, you're such a smart boy, according to entity theory of intelligence, that maintains that intelligence is really an innate trait and something that's fixed and really can't be improved, which I would consider to be completely and utterly wrong. So when you say things like this, and you've got to be very, very careful about how you raise and bring up children and what you say to them, in order to make sure that there's always sort of room for development, and that you're passing on the sort of right message. So you're actually suggesting with this particular statement that intelligence is finite and fixed and can never be improved. You just pop out the womb and you're smart, and that's it, which I don't really believe myself. So you worked so hard on that puzzle. This is the sort of incremental theory of intelligence, and they believe that intelligence is malleable, something that can in fact be cultivated through time and effort, and this is exactly what I believe myself, because I'm not really particularly intelligent in any way, shape or form, but I do have a bit of a work ethic, and I will work at something until I get it, and that's the way it always sort of works with me. Video games are the ideal training ground for acquiring an incremental theory of intelligence, because they provide players concrete immediate feedback regarding specific efforts players have made. They use failure as motivational tools, and provide only intermittent chances for large-scale successes. Okay, so there's persistence in the face of failure, which reaps valued rewards. So the perfect sort of ideal training ground for incremental theory of intelligence, which is very, very important, I would say. So you're always sort of trying to constantly shove a great big boulder up a hill. That's great. Or you're trying to sort of, put balloons on a cactus, or are you? That's probably slightly impossible. Anyway, this sort of depends what you're trying to go for. In terms of characteristics of flow theory, that's what games sort of provide or can provide. This is complete concentration on a task, complete immersion. There's clarity of goals and rewards in mind with immediate feedback. There's transformation of time. We've all done that sort of thing. We've been sitting playing a computer game and looked out the window and went, oh gosh, it's dark, and I've spent 4 hours in a game. The experience is intrinsically rewarding, and you absolutely love it. It's effortless and ease. There is a balance between challenge and skill, so there has to be some form of optimum levels of challenge and skill. Actions and awareness are merged, losing self-conscious rumination, and there is a feeling of control over the task as well. So I've got this little sort of parable that, not parable, it's a sort of story that I heard, and I'm not going to lie, it's King of the Kickboxers, but it's supposed to be a sort of ancient Chinese story where this guy has to fight a warrior the next day, and he decides to go to a master, and he says, what can you tell me that will enable me, to defeat the warrior the next day? And he says, there is absolutely nothing that I can tell you to do that, but why don't you make me a cup of tea? He was a tea master, and he says, and as the tea master prepared the tea, nothing else intruded, nothing else interrupted, he was perfectly focused. And then the master turns around and says, tomorrow when you face the warrior, do it with the same aptitude. And when the warrior sees that the tea master is completely and utterly prepared to die, he turns and runs, because while he was doing that, he was completely concentrated. Nothing else existed, nothing else intruded. And therefore, flow had actually occurred. Oh dear, loose. Anyway, so motivations. I've done many surveys at the university showing that sort of, and about 2,226 participants in all of these, so 972 in study 1, 556 I believe in study 2, and 703, which comes to, I believe it was 2,226 participants overall after data cleansing, etc. And that sort of showed that challenge was one of the main motivations for playing computer games, and then curiosity was a sort of close second, followed by cooperation. The only sort of thing that makes it slightly hairy is because in the first study we didn't mention things like pleasure and relaxation on an ordinal scale, but then they sort of came into it and they sort of messed up the rest of the correlations of the results. But never mind. So challenge, curiosity, cooperation, and competition are very important. Okay. Okay, perceptual and cognitive outcomes of playing computer games. Playing games meets players' intrinsic needs for competence and autonomy. And playing games to address players' needs for competence is consistent with the theories of flow and immersion, which identify challenge as an important feature of enjoyment of games. That's actually taken straight out of one of my papers that I decided that we had written as a group in 2012. It's actually quite a sort of famous literature review using serious games and computer games for educational purposes and looking at the empirical evidence associated with that. So autonomy refers to the ability to take part in freely chosen activity and is similar to the need for control described in theories of subjective experience. So uses and gratification theory was developed as a theory of communication, which looks at consumers' more specific media-based needs. So, when applied to computer games, uses and gratification theory to playing computer games and found that in addition to challenge, players play games for really rather contradictory reasons as well. So, emotional arousal, but at the same time relaxation, which is sort of contradictory, ironic and paradoxical. To compete against other players for the ability to take part in fantasy activities, which would not normally be possible, and to interact socially with other players, perhaps. Okay. So, while entertainment games are played primarily for fun and enjoyment, it soon became evident that COTS, so commercial off-the-shelf games, also appeared to be acquiring new skills, or people that played them acquire new skills as well. So the strongest evidence associated with the effects of playing games on skill acquisition comes from research suggesting that playing action games has a very, very positive impact on visual motor coordination and spatial representation, iconic skills and visual attention. So there you go, that was one of the sort of findings of those particular papers. I know that I sort of more or less read that, but it was my sort of paragraph that I contributed anyway, more or less. So there we go. So good, even commercial off-the-shelf games have educational value, and you're talking about sort of iconic skills, spatial representation, visual attention, and pattern recognition. Okay, a reasonable amount of experimental evidence of cognitive benefits includes tracking objects, moving at great speeds, performing accuracy and visual short-term memory tests, switching between tasks more quickly, making decisions about rotated objects more quickly and accurately. Okay, so fantastic. So, when examining the impact of playing games on the acquisition of higher order thinking skills, players displayed an impressive range of higher order thinking or scientific reasoning skills in the discussion forums, such as using data and argument, building on other ideas. So while playing of commercial off-the-shelf games do not seem to acquire some useful perceptual and cognitive skills, limitations in the use of, I beg your pardon, while players of COTS games do appear to get or attain useful perceptual and cognitive skills, limitations in their use is the main problem, and that's matching and learning, matching the learning function to the game, if that makes sense. So, to use World of Warcraft as a sort of example, their observations of players' contributions to the discussion fora in the online game World of Warcraft led them to predict that players of these games frequently engage in high-level discussions and arguments as they tackle the difficult and sometimes undefined problems which are present during these particular games. So just to sort of reiterate that, while they actually do seem to acquire perceptual and cognitive skills, actually matching that with the learning function of the game to what is being learned is quite difficult. So that's the sort of main limitation of using commercial off-the-shelf games. All right. Negative aspects of computer games. The majority of negative aspects of computer games in the empirical literature generally are associated with excessive users, and that is the same with absolutely everything in life. Having a drink's okay, becoming an alcoholic leads to problems. I'm not saying it's bad, but it does lead to health difficulties, the ability to function, that sort of thing. And addictive tendencies go through society like you wouldn't believe. All you really need to do is walk down the streets of Paisley, and you will see that there are a number of people that suffer from these addictive tendencies. And whenever someone starts to do something particularly excessively, then that's when it becomes a difficulty. Whether that's drugs, alcohol, video games, or video gaming. Video gaming has recently been more or less recognised as an addiction, or eating addiction as well. So all to do with excessive users. Okay, Conley and Stansfield point out that the majority of the disadvantages cited in the literature revolve around the long-term effects of violence on game players. However, there's really no consensus on this. So, the Washington Times in 2015, some scholars, humanitarian groups, even military officials say that video and computer game makers can answer a sort of call of duty to incorporate international rules of warfare and human rights into their battlefield scenarios. Okay, even though there's sort of violent connotations, it can lead to violent, aggressive behaviour. In terms of that, we have sort of Exidy's Death Race right there from the 1980s. And you were able to sort of run over people in this, or run over little demons, as they then called it, and it would be replaced by a cross. You've got this, what was this called again? Custer's Revenge, that's it. And you can see this poor person, this poor lady tied to a cactus, and she's about to be raped by that cowboy. Can lead to sort of aggressive behaviour. And then, of course, we have Grand Theft Auto. And when you're considering things like the Columbine High School shooting, because that always happens in sort of American culture and sort of over here as well with increasing frequency. Both Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold from the Columbine High School shooting were fans of video games such as Doom, Wolfenstein 3D, Duke Nukem 3D, Quake, and Postal. And in Postal, the main character says, "I regret nothing," before shooting himself in the mouth, pretty much like Eric Harris did. And essentially, I mean, that was 15 victims. Was it 15 victims? I believe it was 15, including the two shooters, or was it 25? I can't quite remember. It was a massacre anyway, it was horrible. And basically, after that, some of the parents of the victims filed several unsuccessful lawsuits against video game manufacturers because of that. In 2011, Brown versus the Entertainment Merchants Associations, which was a very famous case. The link between violence and video games was inconclusive. And also, video games are covered under the First Amendment, the rights of free expression and action that are fundamental to the democratic government. So, these rights include freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and freedom of speech. And the content can't be regulated by any government. Okay? So that was Exidy's Death Race from the 1980s, and good. At the same time as all this was happening, there were lots of publications in psychology journals stating that there was a link between video games and childhood violence. This was kind of exacerbated by the fact that there were also publications at the time that were extremely flawed, I suppose, neither really confirming or denying this. And that sort of resulted in the video games rating scales. Okay? So there's PEGI there. Other negative aspects can lead to destructive behaviour and attitudes. There's definite gender stereotyping. Females really prefer more non-violent games. So in terms of female signifiers, you get Princess Peach there. She's got lush lips jewelry, long sleeve gloves. She's always being kidnapped. Mario has to rescue her. He's boyish. He's got his dungarees, his mutton chops, that sort of thing. There's also exaggerated sexuality. We all know Lara Croft. When I was young, it was the Pentium 1, the Pentium 2, the Pentium 3. These things are entirely exaggerated. And there's a female there holding onto Shao Kahn's leg, being incredibly sexually submissive. And then, of course, males aren't immune from that either. You see the guy there with his six-pack, and that's apparently how men are portrayed in video games. And we probably all know that in real life it's not quite the case. And there's Tomb Raider as well. So, rugged individualistic attitudes, negative aspects as well, stifle creative play. Gaming addiction is very, very serious. You get people that play video games absolutely constantly. It's almost ridiculous to an extent. I've had to more or less liberate some people from the course at some stage because they were playing far too many video games. It was actually becoming detrimental to their health. It results in poor sleeping patterns because if they become addicted to things, then they play it into the wee hours of the morning. They don't get appropriate sleep. And sleep is the main thing that will in fact keep you sane. So if you consider that your sleeping hormones like serotonin and things like that are regenerated during the sleeping process, once you reach REM, sleep, rapid eye movement, then it needs to happen in order to preserve your sanity. You need about 7, maybe 8 hours a night. Humans vary on this. But if you don't sleep, invariably, eventually you will go insane. And there should be far more research associated with sleep and things like depression and suicidal ideation, because it's one of the sort of key factors. And we've all, regardless of what we say, I'll be particularly honest here, there have been times where I think, oh my God, what a terrible day. I just feel like killing myself. And then once you have a sleep and you feel regenerated, suddenly things are not quite so bad. That is probably quite an extreme example. Obesity as well. People are sitting at computers, playing them all the time. It's a sedentary lifestyle sort of thing. Problematic cultural ideologies, alienation effect, and a sort of electronic autism. These are just some of the things that academics have highlighted over the years in terms of negative aspects. Now, what I sort of mean by that is inability to communicate, perhaps, and they feel as if all they're really doing is, looking for escapism, and it leads to a whole load of different health issues. A number of people that I know that play video games that are far, far, far younger than me have been diagnosed with diabetes too because of their constant consumption of energy drinks and sweeties, sitting there just playing and not really exercising or moving in any way, shape or form. So there's a lot of difficulty there. They are ubiquitous, they're everywhere, they're in mobile phones, they're in tablets, they're in laptops, they're in consoles. All these different consoles nowadays that I possess, and I barely even play them, if I'm being honest about it. I play the piano, and I'm more of a developing type person, and I really have to do about 2-3 hours of exercise a day. So that's my addiction, but at least there are worse things to be addicted to, trust me. Okay, so Michael McIntyre is my absolute favourite comedian, but in one of his sketches he does say that his children come running, Lucas and Oscar come running into his room and say, "Good morning, Daddy, good morning." And he says, "Not for me, it isn't," and he flings them an iPad. And that is something that you see with increasing frequency nowadays, where the generations require instant gratification. They're always looking for the dopamine hit. They require, constant stimulation, and it's very, very difficult to provide that. So people or parents just sometimes, give their children iPad and say, "Here, play with that, and leave me alone." But anyway, here's someone. It's from South Park. I don't know who the hell that is. Is it Cartman? Oh, it's Stan. Yeah, Stan from South Park. If in fact that character exists, I don't watch South Park very much. So anyway, he's on the internet there on the computer, and he's getting fatter and more spotty and eating all Okay, positive aspects, highly engaging, immersive, if they're done in moderation, highly engaging, immersive, and motivational. There can be perceptual and cognitive outcomes and impacts. You can acquire knowledge. There can be physiological benefits in terms of exergaming as well, behavioural change. They can be risk-free too, so you can do all these sort of simulated things without any outcome or any sort of risk that's happening in the real world. They can increase self-esteem in particular tasks, perhaps surgical tasks in terms of simulation, and there's a great deal of versatility. So let's look at some of these things. These are some serious games, games for educational purposes. So this is a game called Tactical Iraqi, which is really for language education, where players are allowed to defuse situations without gunfire or bloodshed or anything like that, and that's by learning the etiquette. That's actually been used in 2 tours of duty by 2 different battalions and has been considered to be relatively successful. There are many medical simulations as well, all based in computer games technology. This is a game called Virtual Leader, used for interpersonal training and leadership skills. This is Remission, in order to get people more sort of involved in their cancer treatment. What I'm trying to show you there is the versatility. America's Army, this was actually originally designed for the purposes of recruitment, to show Americans that being shot at was fun. This is a game called Zombie Division, in order to teach primary maths, division to be precise. And this is a game called River City, not the sort of Scottish version of River City, Bob, we were good together. But anyway, it's to teach scientific inquiry, and essentially what sort of happens is a plague is ravaging the land, and you've got to find out how exactly it's transmitted, whether that's going to be through touch, whether it's airborne, or whether it's through water. And it's called River City, so go figure. Second Life as well, so I mean really that's just to show you the sort of versatility of games. Catharsis theory, emotional purification, purging of negative emotions, as it's probably a highly positive thing. Physiologically positive, psychologically positive as well, purging of your negative emotions and aggression. This suggests that playing violent video games may in fact be a useful mechanism for releasing pent-up aggression and diffusing anger as well. I had a friend at school, I remember him, and he used to say, I'm going to go home, I'm going to turn on my Super Nintendo, and I'm going to shoot things. And you went, excellent, well at least he's not shooting people. So that can actually be quite a good thing. Exergaming as well, so there's the Wii there, people are actually moving about. This is how I purge my negative emotions. I used to love just more or less levitating a stormtrooper off the side of a ledge and then dropping him. Brilliant, absolutely fantastic. And then of course you get augmented reality games, which means that people can actually go outside, track these things, capture them, breed them, that sort of thing. But the main thing is they're actually walking around and they're not developing a belly or diabetes too. So it is in fact rather healthy for them. So there's a lot of negative aspects of video games, a lot of positive aspects, and I suppose the key thing is just to remember that moderation is key. Okay, so that's a sort of overview of that. Hopefully I didn't make too many mistakes, and I shall post that up, and if you get any questions on it then let me know. And I'll speak to you next week because we'll actually have an engagement meeting then, and I'm deeply apologetic of the fact I couldn't have them today. Okay, right, bye then, bye.